Welcome to Gross Domestic Problem, the podcast that tackles America's biggest and most urgent crisis head on. The economy is on the brink. Americans feel it. But what if the real cause of the squeeze in their bank account, like an iceberg about to sink a ship, was mostly invisible? That iceberg? The national debt. Every episode of this show will be focused on unveiling this slow motion disaster. How do we get here? What happens if we don't get it under control? And what's the least painful way out? And what do we do in the meantime? There is no do-nothing solution, and every solution will require some sacrifice. But refusing that pain for ourselves means handing it on to the future with little to no control over who it hurts. And if you're like us, that's unacceptable. So let's dive in.
One of the principal reasons for the fact that the national debt is as bad as it is and is getting worse is that the people whose job it is to inform us as voters and as people who make policy by what we do or don't care about, the people whose job it is to inform us about that face a terrible minefield of perverse incentives to actually tell us the truth about it. Most of the headlines that you'll read on the national debt, either they're clickable and not true or need a lot of nuance, or they're true and not clickable. It's very difficult to get your head around the idea of $37 trillion in debt. That's hard to make meaningful, especially when we all know that people have complained about this problem since it was $13 trillion in debt and said that we were facing a cliff and we were about to create the end of Western civilization, and it didn't happen. And so for the people whose job it is to tell us why that's so and why at this point it's actually an issue worth taking seriously, when they struggle to tell us that reality, we struggle to know it, and all of our politicians are incentivized never to get too far ahead of what we think. So I had a fascinating conversation about that recently with Rob Bluey, who is the executive director of the Daily Signal, which is an independent news outlet in Washington, D.C. And one of the great things about this interview is that we got to do it in the Daily Signal's own podcast recording studio. So special thanks to Rob and his team for the hospitality there. And also special thanks to Tim, who was our producer for that show. We got to talk over the course of 45 minutes about what it's going to take to create the possibility for truth-telling for media outlets like his. Now, Rob, I think, is a good egg, and the Daily Signal, whether they have an agenda, and they're not shy about that. So I don't feel like that's anything. I'm not telling anything anybody wouldn't know. But on that agenda, on the list of things that they care about, is the national debt, and still they have a hard time giving this issue the airtime that at least we here at GDP think it deserves. Now, I've said before, the reason we started this show is because I think the national debt is the single greatest domestic policy challenge. It is the iceberg that will sink the entire American ship. And it's my job to convince other people that that's true. Well, these guys are already convinced, and they're having a hard time getting the word out. And we talk about that in our episode. What are the misincentives? What are the misalignments of incentives? What's creating the static and the friction that stops that issue from getting the airtime that we all agree that it deserves? So it's a fascinating conversation about the media landscape in general and about what it would take for issues that really do matter to get there. Because I think one of the problems we have is that for people like me and just voters is that we actually genuinely think, now whether we think this articulably or whether we just think it by the way we act, whatever's not on the front page isn't important. And the debt is almost never on the front page. And when it is, it's almost always because of something that isn't actually true. So what do we do about that? Special thanks again to Rob for hosting us to do that show there. And special thanks to him for letting me poke him in the eye a little bit about this. I gave him the business about it a little bit, and he was not shy about the fact that like there are things that Daily Signal can do better. And he was also extremely informative about the headwinds that they face. And voters need to know about that because we need to puncture the idea that if it's not on the front page, it's not true. It's not important. Most things on the front page are important. Or I would say what I would say is most of the time, the important thing is on the front page. But there are some times when the thing that isn't on the front page, precisely because it's so important, isn't there. And we want to talk about why that is and do something about it as critical media news consumers and as people who care about the fortunes of this country and our obligations to the future. Now, ironically, having praised the Daily Signal and their incredible 5-star podcast recording suite, we had some technical difficulties in the recording of the show. So the conversation starts in media res a little bit. We're in the middle of a conversation about the Daily Signal and its history, but we then quickly move into the meat of this conversation, which is how do we make it so that the national debt becomes as important to readers of news and especially political news as it is in real life. Thank you so much for joining us. Please do follow, give us a review, a 5-star review, wherever you consume podcasts, and tell your friends about us. Tell your friends about Gross Domestic Problem. We are so glad that you have given us a little bit of your attention and joined us for this show and this journey, especially given that it's not feel-good news. It's very challenging, but you're here to face the truth with us, and we're here to make the truth not only bearable, but entertaining. Take care. Thanks so much for joining us for this show.
The massive growth of platforms like Facebook and Twitter at the time. And we said, why don't we create our own media platform, the Daily Signal, to get that message out? We don't need just a blog anymore. We really should expand this, hire our own team of reporters, use the analysts at the Heritage Foundation to provide the commentary and analysis about current events. And so we created the Daily Signal essentially to be the voice that would get out the conservative policy and message.
Yeah.
And then in the summer of 2023, Joe Biden revoked our press credentials at the White House.
Yes.
A year later, we officially legally separated from the Heritage Foundation to become our own media organization. And so we're back in the White House briefing room. We're on Capitol Hill, and we're trying to cover all those stories that that hopefully the audience will be able to check out.
Yeah, blessings in disguise, right? It was sometimes addition by subtraction. And then I think it's worth saying, I've just been in here for the first time today. This is obviously not where this show normally gets recorded. I'm so thrilled to be in this, in Heritage's, fortress here on Mass Ave and just walk before the show started, Rob walked me through all these incredible, the podcast studios. They're really, really going deep into new media. So, but before we even hop into everything else, like how you just mentioned that this is what that sort of Heritage saw this coming. They saw it coming with blogging when they were like, let's get a blogger, when people didn't even know what blogs really were. And then they were like, well, we want to be in front of this changing media landscape. So how do you and how do they read what's happening in media right now?
Sure. Well, Heritage is a 52-year-old organization.
Yes.
Heritage was basically born because there were a couple of congressional staffers, Ed Follner and Phil Trueluck, who were frustrated with the policy organizations in Washington, D.C. There was a particular debate over military aircraft, and one of the other think tanks in Washington delivered the research after the vote had taken place. And so Follner really came in and said, we need to make sure that there's an organization representing conservative values that delivers information to members of Congress before they vote so they can be informed in making a decision. And so I think that, that it took a different form at that point. I mean, you were actually literally printing out a memo and delivering it to a member's office. And Heritage has adapted, as you indicated, over the years. I think first with, at least in my time here, first with you mentioned blogging and then social media, we've seen more and more consumption through podcasts like yours and others that are focused on policy issues. And so if you're not active in that space, I don't think that you are necessarily shaping and framing the debate in a way that is advantageous to your side. And so the creation of the Daily Signal was really meant to do one thing primarily. The Daily Signal is a mission-driven news organization. We don't hide from the fact that we have a conservative point of view and perspective on the world. And we are very much aligned, even though we're separate now, with the same principles that Heritage believes in. And so one of them, obviously, is making sure that we're limiting government, hopefully reducing government spending, tackling this massive debt problem that we have. And when it all comes together, I think it's incredibly powerful to see what those who are on the right side of the political spectrum have been able to do. Obviously, we're up against some big hurdles. Institutionally, I think there the the pull is in the other direction, whether it be on this issue or so many others. And then you're dealing with established legacy media landscape that is oftentimes hostile to your views. Whether you're a conservative or a libertarian, it doesn't matter. Just chances are they probably don't share or align with what you're thinking of.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, you and I met at Freedom Fest, which was my first time going.
And mine too.
Yeah, going to the big libertarian, what is it, Lilith Fair out there. That's probably not a right way to say it. Like Woodstock, some huge just festival of libertarians getting together and celebrating how libertarian they all are. Well, Rob and I we met there and had a conversation about the national debt that I thought would make this. I thought other people needed to hear that conversation. What I really think is interesting, and what I would love for people who listen to this show to get out of it today, is a sense for how the national debt is covered. I mean, both in terms of the editorial decisions that make it up, and how resources are allocated to this sort of thing, how decisions get made about what's important to cover. And I would love for my listeners to have a sense for that, because I think one of the things that when it comes to really any complicated issue, but especially one that is both painful and complicated, like the national debt, what often happens is people think it's the problem that they're told it is. I know that we live in a world where everybody does their own research, where everybody has a social media feed, but honestly, because of the algorithms that drive those things, you decide as the consumer very quickly what you believe, and then they feed that to you. And so it actually matters how these things get covered. And that's really what I wanted to start with here today. And it helps because literally when you and I met, we were in the middle of our conversation about this. And I was like talking with you, Rob, about how the national debt gets covered, when all of a sudden both of our phones blew up at the very same moment. And we looked down and both of us saw Israel bombs Iran. And I was like, I looked up at you and I said, I guess our conversation is over. And you bolted out in one way and I bolted out in the other. So that's my first question. We live right now, we've lived for the last few weeks in a news cycle that is driven by foreign policy. And sometimes the most important things that are happening in the world are not the things that are happening in our backyard. When that happens, domestic problems don't suddenly go away and wait for us to be able to turn our attention to them again. How do you all as a newsroom make decisions on what gets talked about when there's something really important else to talk about?
It's a great question, and I'll tell you, William, it's a challenge on a daily basis. I mean, we're a small team. I think of the various conservative media organizations that are in Washington, D.C., we're probably the smallest. And so you have limited resources, limited people who are able to cover stories. I mean, and the way that we've structured our team is, yes, they have beats that are focused on issues, but they also cover institutions, whether it be Congress or the White House or the Supreme Court. And so when something like that happens, obviously the whole team has to rally and cover different angles, because it's too massive of a story. I'm talking specifically about a war between Israel and Iran now, for one person to probably cover adequately by themselves. And so
all of your Congress reporters had to just go to the other side of the district for a while.
Or they're covering how Congress is reacting to Israel strikes, right? So they look for unique angles, but you're absolutely correct. It does take the attention. So hours before, they could have been covering the one big beautiful bill and some of the provisions that were included in that. And then all of a sudden they pivot to this. And so we try not to be reactionary at the Daily Signal, but there has to be some element of that. I mean, if you're in the news business, just naturally, if news breaks, you're going to run toward the story. And so we try to find that balance, honestly. And to your earlier point about coverage of the debt, I mean, I think largely most media organizations do it poorly. And I think even the Daily Signal, even though that's one of the core tenets that the Heritage Foundation believes in, I think we could probably do a better job. For a period of time this year, by the way, when Elon Musk was doing the Doge and the Department of Government Efficiency was dominating headlines, it gave us more of an opportunity to talk about government spending and some of the issues associated with the debt. That moment seems to have passed. I mean, I will say in that period of time, for instance, I will sometimes be invited on television programs. There were a couple of moments when I was on Dr. Phil's Merit TV. There was another time I was on CNN This Morning where I talked about it and shared a clip on X, and Elon Musk reshared it, and one had 40 million views and the other 20 million views. So it's not that the issue isn't getting attention at all. It is, but to sustain that coverage, I think what you're talking about is difficult in an environment where we are constantly on an hourly basis being distracted. I liken it in some ways to a squirrel. You see one acorn over there, one over there, and you're just running back and forth. And think about it if you're a news consumer. Scott Rasmussen, the pollster, does a survey where he asks individuals how closely they pay attention to politics. Only 11% of the American people consistently say that they talk about politics or it's in their mind on a daily basis. And so how do you break through and get them to pay attention to an issue as significant and sometimes difficult to understand as the national debt when you're talking about billions and, in this case, trillions?
Yeah, right. I think it's you mentioned just the small beats and being being driven by what's happening, and I think one of the things that one of the national debt, one of the ways that it suffers is that it's always happening, like it's literally every second happening. I'm thinking now of Thomas Massey's debt clock, right, which is just like running up seconds after second, just constantly running, and I think that's the part of the issue is that the national debt, whether it's newsworthy or not, it's always happening.
Yes.
And if it is newsworthy, then it's always breaking news. I mean, every day we're at a record deficit every minute of every day. I just think my question is, I mean, it seems to me that I know that Heritage has the Heritage point of view around fiscal policy is that this is like one of the, if not the dominant domestic challenge. And I think certainly intelligent and people who are in a position to know have said that it's the dominant challenge it's the dominant challenge of the country. It's existential. I'm thinking now of, Admiral Mullen, who used to say that this was the number one, national defense issue was the national debt. And I think now of like Neil Ferguson writing, about the Ferguson law, that if that a country that spends more on its interests than its national defense, that country can't remain, or that no great power can remain great while that's true of it. And so it seems like we have a massive issue. It seems like it is maybe, if not definitely in the top issues. And yet I think newsrooms in general do not cover it as if that were true. And what I'm talking about specifically is allocation of resources and time. Most people don't have a beat. And this is where I kind of poked you in the eye a little bit when we were out in California. But I don't mean to be adversarial. I'm genuinely curious. How do you think about this, given that, like, if it is an issue that is this important, how do you, and if it's, how do you feel that resources and time and energy and column inches are devoted to the issue in proportion with its actual importance to the country at Daily Signal and in the media as a whole?
Sure. And this is one area I'm old enough to have started my career in journalism before the digital news and the data that we have on consumer behavior and attitudes. It has really reshaped how we all think about approaching the news. I mean, my first job was at a weekly newspaper, and you would decide, me as a reporter would work with the editor, and we'd say, okay, here are the things happening in the community this week. These are what we think are important. And then I suppose, based on whether or not the customer purchases the newspaper, you could decide if you had a good week or not, right? Now, instantaneously, from the moment that you publish a story, you can see if the audience is reacting to it. Right. And I do think there is a situation where if you look at consumer behavior or audience behavior, even in our case at the Daily Signal, they tend probably not to click on stories that are related to the national debt. Yep. And so is that an indication that we shouldn't cover it? No. maybe we need to do a better job of telling that story and explaining to the audience why it is important and significant to them. Yeah. But I do think that is a factor, not just here at the Daily Signal, but newsrooms in general. Mm-hmm. We have the benefit of being a nonprofit news organization, always have been, even in our new incarnation, separate from the Heritage Foundation. And so we rely on gifts and donations. And so we don't have to be dependent on advertising. But if you are a for-profit news company and you are reliant on advertising and other means of generating revenue, chances are you might not be doing stories that aren't going to be clicked on and therefore wouldn't drive as much traffic. And so I think editors probably balance that. I don't know. I mean, we'd have to ask them if that's a factor. But I think in our case, yeah, we do pay attention to what our audience is engaged in, videos that they're consuming, podcasts they're downloading, stories they're clicking on, and we review that data on a weekly basis. There have been times, even this year, where I mentioned it earlier, when Doge was really interesting, where the audience was clicking on those stories. Did we do enough then? Maybe not. There's always opportunities. I'd say one last thing. I think that it's also a situation where, because we're talking about numbers, and you can speak to this as well and correct me if I'm wrong here, but I do think that that because it's so hard for people to relate to the scale of the problem, $37 trillion or what does it mean? It's so impossible, because that is a number that seems unfathomable. I mean, it's not even something that you can comprehend in your mind. It's so massive and large that there are other ways for us to try to communicate that challenge and that threat. And I agree with you on the point that it is this existential threat to us.
Yeah, I think it's you made several interesting points that are worth chasing down. One of which was the question about consumer behavior, and of course, I mean, no one who gives a damn about you and your work and can be indifferent to this. They can't say, whatever the customer does, you just have to say what they need to hear. I'm now, I'm thinking of the scene in the Newsroom where one of the former EP of Will McAvoy's show describes his new show as the Will McAvoy's Eat Your Vegetables Hour, right? Like, no, this isn't a real thing that you can do. And yet, I do think what's confusing and I think interesting to me as somebody who's obviously like a kind of single issue fundamentalist. I have the luxury professionally of only talking about one thing, and so I don't have the obligation to try to satisfy the entire news waterfront. But one thing that's interesting to me is that reporters are incredibly clever about every story that they think is interesting. Sometimes they're clever about a story that's not a story, right? And one of the interesting questions that I think reporters are great at asking in every other area is cui bono. Who benefits because of this thing? Who benefits if we get involved in a war with Iran? Like, there's looking at all the defense contractors and they're watching the defense stocks and the price of oil. Like, and I guess the thing is, like, it's curious to me. It's not, I mean, it's quite obvious that there are people who get rich on the national debt. And it's curious to me that that newsrooms wouldn't pursue the question of who's getting wealthy on the national debt. If there are villains in defense contracting, then there are certainly villains in the bankrupting of the country. And I think one of the things that made Doge so interesting is here was a person I'm talking about, of course, Elon Musk, who was willing to say there are villains in this game. And I'm going to start telling you who they were. Now, whatever the truth is, I think in some ways Doge was a missed opportunity, and I don't know how y'all feel about it, but that's, there are ways it could have been something else. But they did a good job of laying bare some of the interests at play.
Yes.
And I think there are people who get rich on this. There are 501c3s and lobbyists who make millions of dollars in donations every year, scaring the bejesus out of people, telling them that they're, that if you elect this person or if Elon Musk gets his way, then your grandma is going to be thrown off the cliff. The old Paul Ryan ad. These are the things that I feel like we need you guys, because nobody else, first of all, you guys have been trained in the dark arts, and so you have this, none of us, we don't have what y'all have, which is the ability to say, wait a second, that meme is pretty popular. That's something they've been saying ever since poor Paul Ryan was the Speaker of the House. Who benefits from this narrative? And you guys are so great at that. And it's just confusing to me sometimes. And again, I don't mean to poke you guys in the eye. I'm very grateful for the work that our media do against some pretty tough odds. At the same time, I just wonder, why are the people who are so imaginative, so creative, so clever, all of a sudden when it comes to the national debt, they look at big numbers and they're like, I don't know. Like,
well, I think that there's a couple things there. Number one, I think that there's a general reluctance, both among Republicans and Democrats, to want to take on this issue. I mean, there, with a few exceptions. I mean, there are, you mentioned Thomas Massey earlier, Rand Paul being another. So, I mean, we can probably count maybe one or two hands.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, we don't even need all of our 20 fingers here, maybe.
Right. So I went back and I showed you this before we talked. And so this was a series that Bill Beach and I did back in 2009 or 2010. And there's a chart in here that I was refreshing my memory earlier. And it looks at both Republican, well, it looks at all the past presidents, again, up through Obama. And it looks at Republicans and Democrats. They're equally bad on this issue.
Right.
And specifically to your point on Doge, I think that it probably, it was certainly great to have that exposure. Underwhelming in the fact that I think the initial targets were to try to cut the deficit from 2 trillion to 1 trillion. And I think so far we have about 175 billion or something. So there's a long way to go there. But throughout all of that, you had situations like, I'm looking at this, there was a proposal to make $5,000 rebate checks from the Doge savings. And the Daily Signal, I'm very proud of the fact that, we did a story pointing out that House conservatives would rather use that money to pay down the debt than send stimulus checks to the American people, which, just as a conservative, I'm not supportive of. And so I think that highlighting things like that are roles that we can play. But I'm not disagreeing with you. I think that this is a good reminder that there are people who benefit financially from doing this. There are institutions in Washington, D.C. that would like us to continue on this trajectory for as long as they're alive and in existence, and we need to try to do that. And the solutions are tough. I'm not dismissing that because you don't really have a great outcome. Back when we were talking about this in 2010. I want to say that the national debt was 9 trillion or something like that, right? So I mean, think about just how massively it's been. Again, Republican and Democrat administrations and Republican and Democrat Congresses that have contributed to this problem. So if you could point to one or the other, maybe you'd have a champion, but sadly, no.
This is why we need you. This is why, no one, we can't rely on anybody down the way, and on the Hill to do it, because there's no team that's going to win an honest This is what happened to Elon Musk. There's no team that wins an honest reckoning of this, because the moment that they start finding like, hey, what if we did something about this cut? Every single federal dollar spent has a constituency who's highly motivated. And so suddenly you have people who've been cheering on Doge saying, wait, not so fast, not my thing.
Yes. And that's and we're talking about in large part discretionary spending, which is increasingly becoming a smaller portion of the budget. And there seems to be even less of an appetite to tackle Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, despite the fact that the trustees of those programs have been warning for years that they are a problem, just waiting for the American people to feel the effects. And I think we just heard recently about Social Security, right? So I don't know. Maybe it needs to be a new generation. Maybe it needs to be. Right now the baby boomers have largely been in control of Washington and the way things are done. There may be an incentive for them not to necessarily change the status quo or disrupt it. But you're absolutely correct that there's not a desire at all to talk about entitlement programs.
And I think and a lot of that is what's the old proverb about the person who says, I have to find where my people are so I can go lead them. This is the way it often works in Washington, is that you stick your finger in the wind and then you jump one step in front of it and take all the credit. I think this is where you guys really play an important role. And obviously you're not only you guys, I want to talk about that too, because obviously the media landscape is changing as well. But it's one of those places where there's so much more that can be done. And if you guys don't do it, nobody will, because the AARP is organized. They're happening, and they know exactly how to buy off reporters, and they know exactly how to get their names in the paper in all the right places. They know exactly how to get into the congressman's deepest nightmares. They know exactly how to do all this. And that's the thing, is there's even Elon Musk was limited in what he could do, precisely because the president he was serving and that president's opponent in the previous presidential election took the pledge at the very beginning never to touch any of the benefits of these programs that are the ones actually doing the damage from a fiscal policy and national debt perspective. As you pointed out, other than entitlements over the next 30 years, those everything else in the budget is going to run at a slight surplus. These are the drivers. And nobody wants to talk about that because they're afraid.
Yeah, well, I think they probably look back to 2005 and saw what happened to George W. Bush when he tried to make some reforms to Social Security, and essentially it derailed his second term as president. So if you are in a position like Donald Trump or Joe Biden, of course you're going to feel the incentive. And then from a political strategist, or if you're the campaign manager, you would probably be giving them that advice, because why would you alienate a certain constituency that doesn't really want you to tackle this? And finally, if you're in the news media and you feel that you're being pushed and pulled in other directions, then this is probably not going to be the story that you necessarily cover. But I do think that there are I do think that there are probably some ways around it, and you referred to the changing media landscape just a moment ago, and I think one of the things that we're very cognizant of is the fact that as consumers, as news consumers, continually seem to be losing trust in news brands. And I worry about that as the leader of a news brand. And put more trust in those individual voices who maybe they are getting their news from, whether it be on Instagram or X or whatever platform it might be. That's something we need to be aware of. But those individuals could potentially really tell that story maybe more persuasively than we have.
I'm very curious how you think about that, about this in general, because as you pointed out, this landscape is changing. Consumers in general don't trust news brands anymore. They prefer their news, they prefer their news and their commentary to be kind of the same thing.
Yes, they do.
That's probably always been true. And then, and you had brands that just pretended with greater or lesser effectiveness that they weren't doing that, when in fact they kind of always were. But I think, I'm curious how you guys think about trust, because I think one of the things that now as a news brand, one of the things that you have to do is you position yourself similarly to other news brands, and yet you have to say not like that, but like this. And so I'm curious about your trust us pitch. I think I told you before, before we met up today, that my background in this, I've already quoted Newsroom once. My wife is probably going to play a drinking game about this, just listening to it with friends. How many times does he quote the Newsroom? And then they take a shot. Because I'm sort of half that. I grew up, I'm 42, so I grew up in an era when Aaron Sorkin was a relevant cultural voice about politics. And then on the other hand, if you can imagine hillbilly elegy but with no hills, that's the part of Florida that I grew up in. Just really, I was in a trailer park with a brothel on one side and a meth lab on the other. And so that's that was a very cynical, we were very cynical. We thought all news was kind of just elites talking to each other. I have a therefore schizoid relationship with news media. I'm half idealistic about it and half almost in utter despair. How do you think about trust? Because what you have to do is you're going after people who are disaffected by the major news brands. And yet, so you have to, in some ways, you have to cater to that cynicism and say that cynicism isn't stupid. You're right to be upset. You're right to you're right to think that. But on the other hand, you can trust me. Why?
Right. It's a good question. And then I'd say at the same time, balancing the fact that we also want to make sure that those major news brands are hopefully covering stories that we break at the Daily Signal. I mean, that is one of the goals that we've had from the very beginning, is we would like to be the spot where the news gets its news. So much in the way that the New York Times set the agenda for the three major news networks from the 1960s, probably through the 1980s until you started to see more other voices emerge in the media world. And so what I would say is, number one, being honest with your audience. That's been important from us from the start. I mentioned earlier that we don't hide from the fact that we are coming at the news from a conservative perspective. I think that there's a frustration with news organizations that still adhere to this facade of objectivity. where they present the news in a way that they're telling the audience that they are being fair to both sides or all issues, when they're really not, because everybody has an agenda.
Yeah.
And whether it's an agenda of the news organization or the parent company, or whether it's the individual reporter, chances are they're coming at things based on their own life experiences. And so we try to be honest with them from that perspective. I think the other aspect of ours...
I don't mean to stop you. Isn't that literally what every reporter and every news agency has always said? Though?
What, that they're objective?
No, well, yes, that we try to be honest. Like, of course, that's what you're going to say. What makes it worth hearing you? Why should anybody believe it when it comes
Well,
to
I
you?
think increasingly, as you pointed out, I mean, if you look at the studies from major polling firms, the trust has dropped. But the trust has dropped not only in news institutions, but institutions generally, maybe with the exception of the military and a couple others. But by and large, I think that what you're getting at is people they don't see us as authentic. I'm talking about the news business in general now, and they're looking to individuals. And those individuals in some cases are Joe Rogan, right? Who has built a massive following. It doesn't come from a journal. He didn't go to journalism school or anything like that, right? But there's a gravitational pull in that direction. And I think the large platforms, whether it be YouTube or Spotify or whoever's serving his content, sees that, and that's generally where the audience is going. And so you're right. We are in a very competitive space. It's a challenge on a day-to-day basis. We also don't pretend to try to cover everything. With a staff of 14 full-time people, I mean, there's no way that the Daily Signal can cover all of the news across the globe. And so we try to be honest with our audience in that perspective too, that we should be just one part of their news diet. We hope that they make time for the Daily Signal every day to get some of the news that we're covering, whether it be about Congress or the White House, and the access that we're increasingly getting. We want to challenge the monopoly that many of these organizations have had on these institutions and bring a slightly different perspective, or tell the stories that go unreported, one of which is probably the national debt. Now, the other thing that you're balancing here is a situation where it's generational. So I'd say that an older generation is still probably getting its news from the evening news broadcast, maybe still getting a newspaper delivered to their door. But if you're talking about a 20-something or 30-something, chances are they've never even turned on that nightly news broadcast, and they're certainly not getting the local newspaper delivered in their driveway or apartment.
Somehow it's getting dropped on my doorstep every day. And I'm like, how the hell is this here? It's been for 2 years. I'm like, I never asked for this, and somebody's losing money every time it gets dropped there. How is this happening? This is
some advertiser may think
I guess, I've never once opened it. I've never even pulled out of the bag. It's just there until I throw it away. And it's like, well, I mean.
But my point in that is that I think you have to. We don't have a print publication, so we don't have a newspaper at the Daily Signal. But what we've recognized is that it doesn't necessarily for us. We're platform agnostic, is what we say. So whether you're getting your news from YouTube or Facebook or X, or subscribing to our newsletter or visiting the website, we don't necessarily care. We try to put the information and content everywhere for people to get. And I think that does give us a slight advantage over other audiences, that legacy organizations that either have to produce a daily show, a daily television broadcast, or print a newspaper, and are stuck in that. And I think that's why you see frustrations at some of these older companies, media companies, because they're just out of step with where the next generation is coming from.
Yeah, you guys are in a really interesting spot, I think, because in some ways, like if on one hand you have, CNN or the New York Times, and on the other end, you have Joe Rogan. You guys have tried, like, there are several organizations like yours that have kind of staked out this middle spot. I think like the Free Press is one, Jonah Goldberg's Dispatch is one, where there's like they're building news brands.
Yes.
Now, in those cases, both of those two are probably a little more personal brand related because of Barry's and Jonah's own particular stories and histories.
Right.
But Barry Weiss didn't start the Barry Weiss show. They've started the Free Press, or whatever it was named before, and then the Free Press. And then, Goldberg too. He didn't start the Jonah Goldberg Hour. It's the Dispatch. And so both of them are like they still have an imagination for the value of a person independent news brand. For but for consumers, as you pointed out, and as we've talked about a couple of times already, the preferences seem to go the other way now. We want
Yes.
we want our news and our commentary as one thing, and as a result of that, we pick voices that we liked. And I loved the way Nick Gillespie put this at the conference you and I were at when he was talking about the sort of parasocial effects of news. That basically we want to get into a relationship where we feel some kind of unique solidarity with a particular voice or set of voices. And what that does, whether for good or for bad, is that's your problem to solve. But I think in some ways, what it definitely creates is a world where where those individual news givers, those news channels that are people, have a kind of power that it's impossible for the Daily Signal to compete with. And yet you have to engage in this space, probably have to, you're figuring out how to get them on the path that you want them on.
Yeah, right.
How do I lobby you? How do I get you to contribute but they will never, until this fashion changes, which I imagine will happen about the time when people start asking critical questions about this space as well. Where's the money coming from, et cetera. At a certain point, we'll get cynical about this too, but we're not yet. And so this is where we think the truth is. And as long as that's so, they have a power that you can never touch, even if you buy all of them out, even if you acquire them. What are you guys thinking about how you handle this going? What are the next 10 years like for the Daily Signal in a world where everybody wants a personal brand news agency?
Yeah, sure. So we, for the last 11 years, or for the first 10 years, I should say, we're largely a homegrown team of people that we hired, relatively young staff. We made the decision in January to bring on a big name contributor in Victor Davis Hanson, who does a daily video product. Victor has really helped us grow the audience because obviously he is a known, at least a household name
His
among
book, The End of
conservatives.
Everything, is it just sits on my shelf and just spreads sadness through the house. It's a great book, but my wife looks at it, she's like, why do you read that?
I wouldn't necessarily also describe him as, he is a social media influencer, but of a different generation than I think who you're referring to. And so we have recently formed relationships with a handful of individuals. I can tell you who they are: Isabel Brown, Morgan McMichael. They have both been contributing to our Problematic Women podcast. That's a show that is specifically targeted to young women, hopefully offering an alternative to so many of the other content offerings that are out there that don't tell a right of center perspective on cultural issues. CJ Pearson's another one. We're doing a video series and a series of columns with Tim Young, who has a huge following, over 1 million followers on X. Tim is visiting offices of lawmakers and taking you kind of behind the scenes of what their offices look like. And so a little bit lighter content. And so we're trying to do our best to work with them with the limited budget that we have. But I think that's probably the direction you're going to see. It's not too dissimilar from what you saw with blogging. A lot of bloggers started out independent, and then major media brands decided, they've been able to have great success building an audience and a following. We're going to acquire them and make them part of our brand. And now we're going through another iteration of that, largely, based on the social media followings that these individuals have created. I do think you raise a good point. One of the things that hopefully we have been able to successfully do at the Daily Signal is be upfront and honest about our agenda, which is based on conservative principles. I think that if you look behind the curtain and you start asking questions about who's paying for what content and is it really authentic, or is there some motive behind why an individual is doing that? We've seen in not too distant past that people can get called out on that and lose the trust of their audience. And so that is something that if you are in that creator space, I think you need to weigh. Yeah,
I think for sure. And it seems like part of what you mean, if you want to say, because obviously you said, we're mission driven, we're based in conservative principles. It's not like that's a thing no one's arguing about. Like what actually counts as conservative is certainly one of the main arguments right now. But I'm curious too, when you think about that conservative, whatever that you guys decide, whatever your POV is on conservative, it can't be just, this is the content we produce. You almost have to think about it all the way down. We have to make sure that the people we're aligned with from a fundraising perspective, the people who advertise with us, that they share a deep value set.
Absolutely.
Precisely so that we don't get ideologically captured by the need, by our balance sheet. Because I think that's the thing that has happened, and that, and that with I mean a lot of the creator news economy is sort of happening in secret right now, and it won't stay that way forever. Eventually, enough people are going to get pissed about something that they're going to look to see where that sort of thing is coming from, and they'll uncover it. And I think 10 years from now, we'll look back on this particular period in our history with a lot of like just shock about what we all underwent. And I'm not just talking about, of course, like obviously we are in the middle of like the fallout from Israel and Iran, and before that, there was the 2020 election. Before that, or before and after that, there was the questions around COVID and vaccines. And like, we're all going to look back on this and say, isn't it weird how we all sort of like just decided to get our information from an algorithm that told us what we already think is true? Yes. Isn't that really bizarre?
Yeah.
And yet I think, just because that's possible and you guys aren't free of the need to earn clicks and earn attention, you have to participate in that world in a way that is very measured in the way you kind of come in with your critiques. And so all that's to say, I started with like a, kind of poking you in the eye. I want to extend this olive branch that I understand you guys have hard work to do. It's very difficult to do what you have to do. And at the same time, man, we freaking need you, like this is this is a $37 trillion iceberg that can and will sink this ship. And I think you guys all think that. Yeah. That's what's so hard about it. Is like, I think you guys all agree. We need you to get in here, man. Like you guys can do things that the rest of us can't do. And so, there are, you have found a way to activate the new news economy for things that you guys think are important, man. Like, get out there and acquire a fiscal policy podcast or get moving or partner up with one. We make it happen. We really need it. I mean, it's one of those things where there's such heavy forces allied against it that that reform voices are gonna get drowned out by just the fact that it's inconvenient. Who the heck wants to be the first to fall on this grenade? Yeah, but the grenade will fall on us if we don't.
Well, and thank you. Well, we accept the challenge. We will strive to do a better job of covering this issue, no doubt. But I wanted to say thank you to the Millennial Debt Foundation and your podcast for surfacing these issues. I talked about this project that we embarked on a long time ago, 25 years ago, and it is significant in that there are generational effects that we're now seeing the consequences of. Yeah. And I don't know, William. I have 3 kids. I worry about what future they're going to be confronting with the challenges that await them in the future if our generation doesn't tackle some of these problems now. It's going to only get worse.
All right, 2 last very short questions.
Sure.
One, when you think about this thing that you did back in 2010, my wife often asks me, she'll ask me, she's very blunt with me. She'll ask me, do you think you're good at your job? And I'll say to her, well, I guess it depends on which scoreboard you're looking at, because the scoreboard on which the Millennial Debt Foundation is measured ultimately is the ever increasing national debt. So maybe not. Yeah. How does it feel to have done this, 15 years ago and look at it now?
Sure. Well, so for instance, I go back. I mean, the reason I use the 25 years because I think isn't 25 years the last time we had a balanced budget.
That's
sometime
right.
around.
Yes.
That.
Yeah.
So then obviously like the 8 years of George W. Bush and then the economic recession in 2008. I mean that's really what prompted this project 15 years ago was the financial meltdown that we had in 2008 and the fact that it was a Republican president who ran on a set of issues that we never expected to be seeing these massive bailouts of portions of our economy. So that was really the impetus of this, and Obama then obviously poured gasoline on the fire. No, it's very depressing to think how much worse the problem is today from when we started this. And I do have hope. I mean, I graduated college in 2001. And so, I mean, I was coming into the workforce at a time when there was a brighter future because we all thought it was pre 9/11. Yeah. We all thought, oh my goodness, Republicans and Democrats came together in Washington to have a balanced budget. I mean, we are
Aaron Sorkin moment
on the trajectory. Well, yes, exactly. West Wing was popular at the time. Like all of those things were happening in our country. And so, but at the end of the day, I mean, one of the things that Kevin Roberts, the president of the Heritage Foundation, often talks about is the good life and making sure that Americans can live the good life. And honestly, unless we tackle this problem, it's going to be increasingly difficult to live that good life.
I have been very forthright, offering several things that I think you guys could have your eyes on that in my mind maybe your eyes aren't sufficiently on. You've been very kind to put up with that. What are from your side of the fence, with the stories you guys are chasing now, like what and when it comes to fiscal policy, debt deficit issues, what are advocacy groups, people like us, what are our eyes not on that they should be on?
Yeah, I would say don't underestimate what your competition is. If you're an editor, you are being bombarded every single day, every single hour with pitches, with op-eds, with all sorts of things that are not on this issue that other people want to focus their attention on. So I would say my challenge to you would be just be more ever present, not only with the Daily Signal, but across the board, to the extent that you can. I realize you have a small team too. So, I mean, you're doing the best you can.
You're talking about like, I have 14 full-time people and I'm just sitting here thinking it's an army.
Yes. Right. So I would say, that's one thing. Just be cognizant of the fact that it's a very competitive news environment. So you're just dealing with that. But I think to the extent we love telling, stories, that is the, show people how this problem is not only impacting them now, but will impact them in the future and future generations. And so to the extent that you can work with us to help tell better stories and make them more compelling for our audience, I think that's a good challenge that we could, perhaps work on together.
Yeah. Thanks so much for joining us today, Rob. This is really fun conversation.
Thanks for visiting the nation's capital, William.
My goodness. Yeah, this is man, I'm going to be so annoyed when I have to go back and like film this the way I normally film it. Like, this is ridiculous what I have to do and have to go through. It's like the first time you're brought into somebody's like luxury penthouse and you go back to your your normal single family home. You're like, this place sucks. Or like people from Manhattanites who get out of the city for a while and then they come back and they realize they don't have any room. That's what it'll be from now on.
Well, you bet. Well, special thanks to my colleague Tim Kennedy for making it all happen.
Yes. The control room without which nothing good happens that happens. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
It's really something.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, leave us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast platform, and don't forget to subscribe to the show. Want to dig deeper? Follow us at millennialdebt.org for more insights, updates, and ways to be part of the solution. Thanks for listening.